should be. That little red thing says we're live. I'm going to double check just to make sure. If there's anything we've learned over the last year, it's that Zoom can go wrong very easily. So see us on here. Usually it takes folks a minute or two to kind of catch up with us anyways. Oh, I see us. There we are live. So great. Again, we'll give it a minute or two for folks to catch up. We're just discussing going out to eat. I still have not eaten inside a restaurant yet. But,
not true. Not true.
We were outside. We were on the patio.
True. That's true. Sorry, you're right.
Yes, Chris and I had lunch at Hunter's Head out on underneath the big tent yesterday. So, it was a little cold, a little windy, but
it was all right. It's good to be out. It's good. It's good to be around people.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. You know, as much as I've enjoyed these Zoom programs, I hope that we don't have to do them too much longer.
I think by the fall we'll be okay.
Yeah. One thing I will say about it is it's allowed us to really reach out to like the network of historians we know that live too far away to actually be a regular part of our programming. You know, to be able to talk to people all over the country has been fantastic. That's the silver lining to all of this.
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
Give it just another minute and then we'll begin. So I will be monitoring the comment section on Facebook. So if people have questions, we encourage people to ask them. So hopefully we'll have some good stuff on there. All right, well, we'll go ahead and begin. Good evening and thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Travis Shaw, your very unfashionable host for this fashionable program this evening. The Virginia Piedmont Heritage Area has collected a panel of our local experts here to discuss the history, the fashion, the tradition of sporting clothes through the ages. And, you know, being in hunt country, we're really going to focus in on the equestrian sports, so fox hunting, side saddle riding, and so forth. And joining me tonight, we have, as I said, a wonderful panel of experts. We have Devon Zebrovious with the Side Saddle Chase Foundation. We have Mark Metzger with Highcliffe Clothiers, Middleburg's own Highcliffe Clothiers, and my old friend Christopher Wilson of Hunt Country Clothiers. So thank you all so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having us.
And for those of you just joining us, as I said, we'll be monitoring the Facebook comment section tonight. So if you have any questions for our experts, we'll try to get to them all. Before we begin really diving into the history of the clothing, I'd like to kind of go around the panel and get a little information about you guys and your backgrounds, just a few minutes on, you know, your connection to the equestrian community, your clothing experience, and all of that. And I'll start with Chris, since I know Chris the best here.
Yeah, I've known Travis for a while. I started out as a historical clothier doing clothing for reenactors, Civil War, Rebel War, and civilian period clothing. I moved out here to Middleburg about 8 years ago, and in my search for somewhere to board a horse, I met Karen Eubank of Eubank Clothiers and began to work with her as a tailor for her equestrian clothing business. I started making all of her hunt coats and some of her hunt breeches. Not my favorite thing, but hunt coats I love doing. And I've been doing that for the last, I guess, 5 or 6 years now. So.
All right, thanks, Chris. How about you, Mark? How did you get involved in the world of fashion?
Well, I have been in the world of fashion since I guess I've been in the world of fashion since 1972. I used to sell ski and tennis clothing and wholesale skis and things like that. And then I sold silk fabric in California for 2 years. And then in 1983, I went to work for a major national chain of custom clothing stores. And I went from a management trainee to my last position was senior vice president for 89 stores and in the corporate sales department. And then I went on my own in 1995 and had a shop in DC for a dozen years. And then in 2007, when everyone was doing things because the world was coming to the end, so to speak, with the economy, I moved my business from DC to the front of Journeyman Saddlers in here in Middleburg. And that's where, just because I'm in, hunt country and the equestrian world, that's where I got most of my, I don't want to say experience, but my exposure to the equestrian world and the different types of clothing that they wear for the different types of riding. There's many, many different types of riding, and there's clothing that goes along with all of them. And I'm also the past president of the Custom Tailors and Designers Association here in America. I was the president for 2 separate years, and it is the longest continuously running trade association in America. It started in 1880, I believe it is, if I remember correctly. And I just have a love for fabrics, for beautiful suiting fabrics. I love tweeds and all the things, the cavalry twills. I just, my goal is to make someone look better leaving than when they walked in. And I like dressing people, whether it be for sporting events or formal events or whatever.
Thank you.
That pretty much sums it
And
up.
last but certainly not least, here we have Devon, the Side Saddle Chase Foundation. Tell us a little bit about your background, Devon.
So unlike Chris and Mark, I am not a maker of clothes. However, I have been a active researcher / historian of side saddle and hunt clothing. I have been involved in the horse world since I was about 14 months old when I started riding, and did a bit of hunting with Pony Club when I was a junior. And then after I moved to Virginia about 20 some years ago, I became much more involved in hunting. And I had always had a great interest, one in the clothing and the historical nature of things, but then also side saddle tied into that. And I had always been fascinated with side saddle. I started riding the side saddle, about 2002, so almost 20 years ago, 2001, 2002. And from that point, I made an effort to learn as much as I could in addition to what I already know or knew at the time in terms of the history and the changing and the evolution of fashion, and why so many of the things that in the fox hunting world and therefore the side saddle world we take for granted as these traditions, why did these traditions come about? And how do they relate to either common standards at the time in especially the 19th century and then the early part of the 20th century, the Victorian era versus the 18th century when you had much more colors and style that was going on. And it just became something I wanted to learn more and more about. From that point, I became very focused in best turnout competitions for fox hunting. So the Virginia Field Hunter Championships, the North American Field Hunter Championships, and then of course, the standards of turnout in side saddle showing. And I have been a multi-time winner of best turnout awards of both the Virginia Field Hunter Championships and the North American Field Hunter Championships, and then was a 3-time national side saddle champion, in addition to years of showing where I had a lot of wins in the under saddle class, of which 25% is appointments. And from that point on, I started a bit of a side business of where I take in on consignment, and I sell side saddle and hunting clothes, primarily side saddle as opposed to astride clothes, and side saddles as well. So I'm very familiar with a lot of hands-on experience of a wide range of habits that have come in either from 1860s, 1870s is about the earliest, of course, all the way to modern habits that have come about. And of course, the different styles and changes that have occurred from, the early part of the habits that came into modern styles.
So I'm just going to preface everything that comes after this by saying I am, despite working in the heritage area for the last 4 years, I am kind of woefully ignorant of a lot of the culture, and especially the material culture. I've seen fox hunting, I've seen a few point-to-point races, things like that. But as someone who doesn't ride themselves, this stuff is almost completely uncharted territory for me. So I'd like maybe Mark to start us off at the very beginning, maybe back in the 18th century, what are the roots of the modern kind of equestrian clothing that we associate with, say, fox hunting?
Well, in my research, if you will, the first picture, or it's very hard to find color pictures, obviously, from way back when. But I have a book that the first that I can find in it, it was 1789 was the first picture that showed a colored hunt coat. Or they didn't call them hunt coats back then. Everything was riding attire. You had day wear, night wear. You had riding attire, but riding attire actually was under a category of sports attire, and they were extremely dandy. I mean, it was a stock tie, but it was it was like wrapped 20 times around, these really long necks and frills, and it was amazing, actually. The layers, many layers, and I was telling Devon earlier that and she knows, and she has a pair, breeches back then were made out of leather, and there was no air conditioning. There was probably no heat either, except for the fire. As the years went on, you started to see more pinks or scarlet coats. But they also had bright green. Bright greens and blues and purples, and again, what you would consider back then. Well, back then it was more normal, but today, by today's standards, they would all be dandies. They would be just this, and then the sporting stuff early on in the 1780s, and then into the early 1800s, the pictures and the styles. I don't know if they all wore spurs back then, but everyone's boots had spurs on them. And they looked a little bit more like Western style spurs than they do just, a straight, I'm not sure, Devon, you'll have to correct me, whatever the straight spurs are called. I'm not sure, but, and then it slowly, again, in the 1800s, it started, you started to see coats that were taken from daily wear and then made into, you saw things that looked like strollers, longer coats with curved bottoms. And some of the coats were cut away. They were like I'll assume everyone knows what sort of like a shad belly, but they were very open at the top, and they would button sort of like a vest down below. Just very, very highly stylized riding clothes that, we would think that the circus was in town now, but back then it seemed to me, I wasn't there, but it seemed to be, that's the way the equestrians dressed. They dressed very fancy. And still to this day, they dress fancy, but I think the things, from what I understand, again, a thing like a stock tie really had dual purpose. Some of the clothing, if If you needed a bandage, you had a stock tie right there. If you had to strap up your arm, if you got thrown off your horse, or you needed to set a bone somewhere in the field, you could do that with parts of the clothing. Some of them had dual purpose. And over the years, they haven't really changed much. A frock coat is a frock coat. Basically, the fabrics may have changed. Nowadays, you have four-way stretch and high performance things. It's a long way from, a leather pair of breeches or something, a 30-ounce cavalry twill that, you wear out before the breeches wear out. That's it in a nutshell. I mean, it hasn't changed that much in terms of the actual style. The fabrics have changed a little bit, but they're still, you're still doing the same thing. You're riding through the brush. You're wearing tweeds, or you're wearing heavy Melton wools. And, tweeds were the first, they're pretty much the original camouflage. Tweeds were worn riding. They were worn if you went, bird shooting or any kind of hunting. You wore your thorn-proof stuff, which is all that type of fabrics all made their way into equestrian wear at some point. Breeches, I know the formal ones out of wool used to be made out of the cavalry twill, and it's called the cavalry twill because the cavalry on horseback wore it. Stuff that will stand up the test of time and the test of wear. And it also, and Chris is smiling, it also tailors very nice. You don't have to be, and I mean this with love, you don't have to be as exact, because that fabric is so heavy, you don't see the wrinkles that you do in all these fancy lightweight things that you do now. Those garments will, lasted forever. Devon was saying earlier, what year do you have a side saddle curtain from, or apron from?
I have side saddle habits ranging, the earliest is about 1860s.
Yeah, I mean, very few pieces of articles of clothing will last from 18 whatever, some of them don't last from 3 years ago. So the fabrics, and that's what I really love about the equestrian world, is I love beautiful fabrics. There's beautiful, beautiful tweeds from many different places in the world, mainly England, Scotland to Ireland, where they're known for their tweeds. But there's just some beautiful, beautiful fabrics and some very handsome and elegant men and women wearing the clothes. That's what excites me about it.
Well, one thing as kind of an outside observer that's always struck me is, when I think of fox hunting attire or equestrian attire, it's very timeless. It seems as if, you talked about how it really has not changed. It seems like it's kind of frozen in the late 19th, early 20th century. I can look at riders, a picture of riders from the 1920s, and it looks essentially the same. I mean, what about that period? Why did the clothing kind of seem to freeze in that period? Is this something that maybe Devon, I don't know, since you collect this
I'll just say one thing and I'll let her talk. Because it's purpose clothing. It's clothing for a purpose rather than, you don't wear it, around here they wear it to the Safeway. However, it's not clothing that you put on to go to the Safeway. You're doing a specific sport, and that's the clothing that sport requires, or is part of the culture, if you will. A top hat hasn't changed from, they've gotten higher, shorter, but a top hat is a top hat, so to speak. A pair of white gloves is a pair of white gloves. A frock coat is a frock coat, and they'll last pretty much forever. And there's no reason to change them. They're specific purpose built.
Well, I think also it had gotten to the point where that time period was also your heyday of fox hunting. And so that was the time of, the high Leicestershire hunt. So it was your corn, it was your leadberry, it was the beaver, it was, what you think of the big hedge country. That's where the focus was. And so before that point, there hadn't been quite so much formalized hunting. There were packs that had been around in existence 1600s, 1700s, but it wasn't quite as it was today. And by the time it got to the high heyday, they, again, in the later 19th century, early 20th century, till about 1930s, prior to the Second World War, they had figured out what was really working for them in terms of attire for the country that they were crossing. So that was why you had your mountain wools, your cavalry twill, your leather, things that would withstand the conditions. So it was the mud, it was the rain, it was the thorns, because they're jumping these blackthorn hedges. So if your horse stops and launches you in the middle of a blackthorn hedge, is your clothing going to protect you, or you're going to have a 1.5 inch thorn stuck through it? And so that's why you had such a tight weave of clothing. And then when it came to, most of us are familiar with the style of breeches at the time, which had those really, which you think of as the elephant ear breeches that are really flared on the thighs. Well, of course, they didn't have stretch fabric. Those breeches were made out of wool or cavalry twill. And so the only way you could get them to move was to have all that excess fabric there, to allow people to get on the horse and be comfortable on the horse. Of course, the boots, those had been around for quite a long time. Those protected the legs from, branches and thorns and the sweat of the horse and the rub of the saddle. So again, by that point, people had figured out what had worked. Where you kind of had the evolution was in the women's attire, because the gentleman's attire was very much standardized. You had more formal attire, so your weasel bellies, your cutaways, your swallowtails, things that you hear about now in the dressage world, the shad belly. The styles were slightly different for the men, but they would really only have those either if they were a true Corinthian. So they were someone who was out there to make a splash, to have attention drawn to them, or the gentleman who saved them for the opening meets or the big lawn meets, at the castles or the country houses. And the rest of the time they were wearing their frock coats, because that gave more length and protection to the thighs from the weather with that longer cut coat. Of course, ladies, you had them side saddle, starting in not till after the invention of the leaping head, which was that lower curved pommel on the side saddle, did you have ladies who were really out in the hunt field. It just wasn't possible for most of the ladies. The Empress of Austria aside, who is a very rare creature who did what she did in a single pommel side saddle. Once ladies had the evolution of the side saddle that enabled them to jump and keep up cross country with men, then you had them coming out and being just as much of a thruster for some of the ladies at the front of the field as your Corinthians gentlemen were. But even then, when they started out, the ladies were wearing full habits in the sense of a skirt. It was a full skirt that they sat on. It quickly became obvious that that was something that was not very safe. And there were designers at the time who were looking at how can we modify this so that these women are still wearing clothing that was in line with the standards of the day. So you had the beginning of the evolution from that full skirt that they sat on to the early safety skirt, which looked almost identical to the regular skirt, that longer skirt that they wore, but it actually had a cutout on the side, just almost a slit and a hole, that they could put their legs over the pommels of the saddle so that if they came off, there was no material to get caught on the pommels. And that continued to evolve until around the 20th century. about late 19 aughts to about the mid 19 teens, you had the evolution of the safety apron, which is what the standard of today's side saddle riders use, which looks like a full skirt, but literally just wraps around you, and you have breeches or jodhpurs underneath that you sit on. And so therefore, if you come off, there's no material whatsoever that you can be caught up for. But still, the standards, the traditional material at the time was the heavier material, that mountain wool and the cavalry twill, to withstand the elements. And because that the English hunting was sort of the quote unquote standard for people to emulate, that's what Americans started to do and what they looked at when it came to their hunting attire. The French, on the other hand, have a bit more theatrics still in their attire. And if you look at, they have the tricorn hats, they have much more color, they have gold braid, and even their hunting typically is stag hunting. It's much more ceremonial. And while you have some influence, that really stayed on the continent. And so France, Belgium, Holland, where they still have that, still have hunting on the continent, they look to the French. They look at their styles, and they're much more flamboyant, as opposed to the English version, which then became the American version, which was really rooted in the Victorian austere fashion. So it got rid of all those colorful habits that you had, the ladies, which are based on like military attire with lots of braids and frogging and fun colors. And it became your blacks, your navies, your Oxford grays, your charcoals, if you were with a Harrier pack, you had green, and it started that change. And then you had the Edwardian style, which you had a bit more of a slight amount of the tweeds that would come in. The jacket behind me, that's a 1920s style, but it still was just much more formalized than you had had previously in the early part of the 19th century and of course the 18th century.
I'm so glad you touched on the ladies' fashions, because even as kind of ignorant of this stuff as I am, I've obviously noticed there's a huge difference in side saddle riding, in competition, what they are wearing versus what I was used to seeing. So one particular item that I don't know, I didn't pick up if you mentioned, was I've noticed side saddle riders wearing veils. What is the significance of that particular piece?
So a veil would only be worn by an adult lady first, so 17 years or older. And a veil would be always worn with your silk hat, what people think was a top hat, but it's appropriately called a silk hat for a lady, because an appropriate size hat was made out of silk, not beaver fur, which men's typically wear. And so the veil, which is a very fine weave, it literally works to keep your hat on, number one, because it's quite taut, and you would always have a bun, and so you can loop it around the back of your bun to make it a little tighter. So it really secures your silk hat on your head. It also works to help keep your complexion for those rare sunny days in England. It helps to break it up because it didn't have sunblock. And of course, it works beautifully at hiding lines. So if you have some wrinkles, the veil, it's just like a Photoshop. It just takes everything off. It's quite amazing. There is a bit of controversy about whether you wear a veil with a bowler. So modern take is that if you're an adult and you're wearing a bowler, either black or brown, you would wear a veil. Of course, if you're wearing a brown bowler, because if you're in foremost wearing your blue, or I'm sorry, your greens or your browns, you would have a brown bowler and brown boots. You would have a brown veil. Black bowler goes with black, navy, any kind of blue tweeds, gray tweeds, you'd have a black. there is some controversy. So you've seen it before where in old pictures, some ladies have a veil on, some ladies don't have a veil on with a bowler. So there's nothing really set in stone as to that. But like I said, standard sort of today is that you would wear it if you're 17 and older. The other thing that could be interesting was a take in the early 20th century that only adult married women were allowed to wear a silk hat. And it was your unmarried women that were wearing a bowler. Think of the hunt field as the modern day online dating. It was very, you didn't have to scroll right. You scroll left or whatever. I haven't done it. So, but I just see people flipping. But that way it was very easy to tell whether someone was available. So if someone caught your eye, you admired their form over a jump and they had a bowler on, well, they were either a junior or they were available. So it allowed the gentleman to have some idea of who was appropriate to approach her.
So all of this is very, not only stylish, but very practical. Yeah. So turning to you, Chris, say I'm going to join a hunt and I need to be outfitted from head to toe. Walk me through what I would need, you know, starting with the hat on down, you know, what are the different styles available, and is there any kind of particular symbolism or meaning to different styles, colors, cuts, things like that?
Sure. Well, starting with the hat. Nowadays, in the old days, it would be called a hunt cap. Today, that was the precursor to the modern riding helmet, which is much more padded and meets standards for a fall, for protection. That was either black, brown, or even navy. Brown, or oftentimes black hats, have just been out in the field forever and ever and ever and have just turned brown from sun exposure. You would wear generally a white shirt. In the formal season, you'd wear a white shirt and a stock tie, which is a white tie, which wraps around your neck a couple of times and then has a very specific type of knot, which is essentially a square knot, but then the two ends are tucked in and then pinned with a pin so that the ends don't go flying all over the place when you're riding.
So similar to like an 18th century.
Very similar. Yeah, it's a stock tie, which you're very familiar with in the 18th century.
And everything. Okay.
Correct. You would wear in the formal season, you wear a frock or a riding jacket, which is essentially a hacking jacket, which is like a sport coat. But in the formal season, it will be either black or navy blue. In the cubbing season, it would be a tweed jacket, just because it's less formal. It's a less formal look. You would wear, depending on your position in the hunt, you would wear either tan or white breeches, and you would wear black boots during the formal season, brown boots during the cubbing season. The boot tops, generally mahogany tops, are worn generally by the staff and the masters and members who have earned that right. Now, the hunt coat, the formal coat, there are a lot of traditions to that. The pink or scarlet coat is generally worn by staff and the masters, and some members who have been invited by the masters to wear the scarlet coat. Most members would wear a black or navy coat. There are traditions with the buttons, like a 4-button coat. A master would wear a 4-button coat. Staff would wear a 5-button coat, and members of the hunt would wear a 3-button coat. There are some more arcane traditions, like the front points on the coat. In the old days, the members of the hunt would have curved or rounded fronts on their skirts, and masters and staff would have square cut corners. Those are essentially the main differences. Nowadays, most hunts, it's the master's choice. It's what he desires. Most of them generally go with the button priorities, but nowadays it's the coat especially the fronts on the skirts, are pretty much up to your own discretion or whatever the master says. Most of them don't care anymore at most hunts. In this country, I don't know how it is in England or Ireland as much. But those are your essential traditional parameters for clothing.
So, I mean, I guess this could be a question for any of the three of you, but you know, what kind of goes into the making of one of these coats, say a hunt coat, in terms of like the fabric, where's that coming from, patterns, you know, the construction. I know that, you know, both Chris and Mark have some experience with that. So walk us through the process.
Well, the coats I make, sorry, Mark.
No, it's fine.
The coats I make are basically designed on old early 20th century English coats. When I worked for Karen, we had several coats from Savile Row, some from Fraser's of Limerick, he's a tailor. He makes coats for the royal family. And Bernard Wetherill, who's another famous tailor. I think he's in London. He's Savile Row. And we had several of those that we literally took apart and examined stitch by stitch on how they were constructed and how they were made. And Karen designed all of her patterns based on those original coats. So our coats they pretty much adhere to the old standards of early mid 20th century hunt coats. She loved the era. She loved that period of tailoring, and that's just how she did it. And that's how she trained me. Like Mark said, these coats they're purpose made. They're not made for fashion. They are work coats. And that's how I present them to people. When they come in and look for a coat, I say, look, I can make this fit you like a sausage casing if you want. But if you want to be comfortable in the hunt, if you want to be comfortable on horseback for 4 hours a day or 5 hours in the rain, in the cold, in the mud, you need a coat that fits you well, that looks good, but allows you the freedom to move and to do the job you're out there trying to do. Because it is a job. I mean, I'm sure Devon could tell you, some days it's really a job. And it's fun, but it's a lot of work. It's exhausting. So you need to be comfortable. You need to look good, but the main thing to me is comfort and wearability. And a lot of that also includes the fabrics that are used on these coats. And the ones we use, I always buy my fabrics from England. And they're heavyweight or midweight cavalry twills. In this area, you really don't need a heavyweight, though some people still prefer them. I have an old Fraser coat in our possession here that literally is like, it's like a suit of iron. If you hold it up, it must weigh 30, 40 pounds. It is heavy. I can't imagine trying to take that thing off at the end of 4 days or 4 hours or 5 hours of riding in the cold and the wet, when that thing probably weighs another 10 or 12 pounds from the rain. It's unbelievably heavy. And I'm sure it'd be fantastic in Ireland, but it's just a little bit heavy for here. So most of the people here, I try to steer them to a lighter weight, finer weight cavalry twill, which is a very tight weave. It's almost impervious to getting cut or ripped or torn, which is a really nice advantage. Some people for really lightweight fabrics, like a lighter weight Melton or even a really, really lightweight cavalry twill, which is what was used in World War II in Americans' uniforms and the officers' uniforms. It's also, but those tend to pick and they can actually literally unravel because it's kind of a weave. It's an interesting knitted weave. So I try to steer people to cavalry twills and to the really heavyweight, really finely finished Melton wools here. So.
Anything to add to that, Mark?
Well, you know, it's the fabrics, as Devon was saying about the jumping over the thorns. The English have they make it very simple for you. There's a book of fabrics called Thornproof. It's just shy of bulletproof. again, one of those fabrics where, you know, in 100 years, it'll still be around, that coat. We've all seen, you know, habits from 100 years ago, jackets from just shy of 100 years ago or more. I'm going to try and I apologize to everybody watching. I'm going to try and unfreeze myself and just show a picture of what the riding habits, the riding wear from 1789 to 1802 look like. So let's see if I can unfreeze myself.
There he is.
And you can see, this is the riding attire from 17 something, I can't read it backwards, 1789 to 1802. The actual styles are not that different. It's the, you know, and these are colorized pictures, but it was very, very fancy. And as Devon said earlier, the French had a whole different, and I won't bore you all. Oh, I froze again. I won't bore you all with that. But the French had some very fancy things, and I don't think they were, I mean, actually, they were probably as heavy because fabric technology, all the fabrics were heavy back then. There was no lightweight stuff. There was no super 200s and 150s that they sell for fancy suits. They were all, as we said earlier, purpose-built and built for endurance, not for, they were built to last. I imagine even if you were in the aristocracy, they weren't inexpensive, that kind of clothing back then. So when you buy something like that, you want it to last. And that's what they built it out of good, tough materials.
And on that note, I just want to add, back in those days, as Mark and as Travis particularly, well, I'm sure Devon as well, know that the biggest expense was fabric in those days. Labor was cheap. Labor cost nothing. What you were paying for was the material, the fabrics that were being used on those coats. So fabrics were chosen to last. They were cut incredibly frugally compared to what we do today. They would have as little as 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, which today is ridiculous. It's like nobody builds a coat with that. Nowadays, when I build a coat, I build it with sometimes 2-inch seam allowances on certain seams. One, because it can be handed down through the generations. And if you've got your son who's coming up fox hunting and you've outgrown the coat or whatever, you've gotten a new one, you can have that coat tailored down to your son or daughter or whatever. So these coats are literally meant to last for generations. The other caveat on an older coat, which I've had several come in, these vintage coats, and people are like, I want this to work. I want to use this. The fabric will last forever. The old cotton threads will not. So sometimes you get a coat that just, once the seam starts going, that coat will just like disintegrate in front of your eyes. And you literally, you could rebuild it, no problem. The fabric is there, it's solid, it's not going anywhere. But sometimes you have to do a lot of work to rebuild these things, and which is great. It's fun. I enjoy doing it, but that's the only problem I think with older clothing is sometimes the threads don't last like the fabric does.
Yep.
One thing I wanted to point out is that I've heard people talk about the fact, in their minds, the fact that the people who were hunting and doing the real equestrian sports in the 19th century and later, that everyone was very small. The things that everyone was very thin, especially the ladies, because most of the side saddle habits that you will see that are in the really good condition, that are vintage or antique, are small sizes. And what I have to remind them is, what you were talking is the cost of the material. It's not that everyone was small. It's that the really small habits were usually worn by women either before they were married or shortly after they were married. And then when they had children, those habits didn't fit anymore. And the habits that were larger were either worn out because they wore them so much, or those habits were cut down to fit. So say a mother stopped hunting, the daughter wants the habit, they would cut the habit down to fit her and take it in. And they would keep repurposing these habits or try to modify them at the time, because it was cheap to modify them. It was not cheap, or it was not inexpensive to have a new one made because of the cost of the fabric. And so
Exactly.
people were much more frugal. And it wasn't like today's, throwaway society where you can just go out and buy another one. And so even then, people have a custom coat made today, and it's going to be, $800, $1,200 or so. And people can go, oh my God, that's so expensive. It was just as expensive back then. And so they did what they had to do to save money, and they started cutting it down. And that's why it's very hard to find the vintage or the antique riding attire in the larger sizes. It wasn't that everyone was thin, it's just that they really wore those larger sizes, or they cut them down for others.
And that's very similar to shirts back then had detachable collars that they would wear. And if you are, as I do, I like to look for them. You can't find a detachable collar for a man. Very, very hard to find it over a size 15 or 16. Anyone with a bigger neck, they wore them until they could no longer wear them, because they would be charged by the size. A little bit bigger, because an inch of fabric, if you save an inch of fabric on 100 different customers, it's 100 inches, and you can make a whole bunch of more things, similar to the coats where there's no seam allowance. It's because it was expensive fabric, and literally every inch counts.
Yeah, I've certainly seen examples of historic clothing from the 18th century with all kinds of weird piecing where, they're trying to get every inch of the fabric into the garment somehow, however they can. So I had a question kind of for the panel. We know that a lot of kind of non-equestrian sporting clothing and equestrian sporting clothing has kind of made its way into popular fashion or kind of everyday fashion. Of course, things that in the early 20th century would have been athletic wear, and certainly like polo shirts, obviously, coming from this background. Any other like good examples of that happening? Is there ways that this kind of fashion has entered everyday fashion or non-equestrian, non-sporting fashion?
Well, I think you can just look at a gentleman's tie to start out. I mean, because you had gentlemen wearing a cravat, which was, a lot of material, and then it evolved from there into, on down until you still basically, that's what a men's tie is, which obviously serves no practical purpose nowadays except a splash of color.
Shh, don't say that too loud.
I mean, I love.
Still try and sell a few of them.
I love buying ties. Okay, so don't get me wrong. I love ties, but
well, you can see. I mean, just in you can see in the boots. I mean, you go to any women's shoe and boot store. There's 20 different boots that are styled like riding boots. Your strollers, your tuxedo and formal wear. A lot of it is taken from it. Well, it basically it had cross pollination of different purposes. You could ride in it, but the same style was done for formal occasions. I have here in the store, when I first came out to Middleburg, I wasn't too up on all the different styles of riding. And one of my tailors makes a beautiful saddle seat coat, or I think that's the name of it. And I think it's a beautiful style. And I had a few of them made up for the store when I first came out. And again, it's a coat that you can, it's a coat style for riding, but it's perfectly fine for strolling down Fifth Avenue. And there's many crossover type outfits that come either use parts of the equestrian thing or come directly from the equestrian world in today's clothing.
Well, I have a question from the audience here, and this one is actually directed to Chris. Delaney asks, he says he's always appreciated the hook vent style and was pleased to learn it comes standard on your coats. What is the background, if there is one, behind that tradition for hunt coats?
Which style? Sorry.
Hook vent is what he
Oh.
said.
You know, I think that's just traditional in frock coats. I mean, you go back to the 18th century frocks in the old days, they had that vent. For civilian coats, the military frocks at the time just had a straight, even vent on the back. They didn't have the crossover. So I don't know where it comes from, but it's been in civilian use and civilian coats for centuries, literally. So yeah, I don't know. Sorry, I can't give a better answer, Delaney.
It's okay. He did say he's very proud that he has both coats from you and from Mark in his closet. So that's high praise right there.
And he and I have had many a hook vent conversation.
So what's your take, Mark? What is your take on that?
It serves no purpose. However, Delaney likes them, so he gets one.
Well, it does give you a crossover of about 1.5 inches,
Yes.
which helps keep the vent closed when you're riding. What also goes with a riding coat is I guess you would call it a modesty panel. I don't know exactly what else you call it, but it's sort of a teardrop shaped panel that goes in the back inside the vent.
Mhm.
Which
I refer
also
to it
keeps-
as the duck tail.
Yes, that's a good way.
That's a good answer. Which keeps wind from blowing up your skirts and also, keeps you from showing more than you want to show when you're bent over, going over a jump or whatever. But yeah.
Okay. Catherine has a question for Devon here. Why did some women wear white vests under their jacket and some women wear canary or yellow? Is that a style choice or a fashion of the day?
That has to do with how formal do you want to be. Your white and your buff, so the lighter colors is the most formal. So you would always pair that with a silk hat, back when you could still wear them in a lot of places, your silk hat, and then your gloves would either be white or chamois. So the very light color. Your canary, your yellows are sort of your average, regular, this is what you wear all the time. So you could wear it with your bowler or just a regular day's hunting, not a lawn meet, not opening meet. And then of course your most informal is your tattersalls, your colored waistcoats and whatnot. So those are typically what you wear with tweeds. But certainly that white is the most formal. So that is the most appropriate for your high holy days. And then back showing, you would do it in the evening performances. So if you were under the lights, you would want to be in a black habit, which is the most formal as opposed to navy, and then your white or your buff waistcoat.
Thank you. So another question for Chris, and I think this kind of ventures a little more into the military side of things. Matt wants to know about buttons holding up saber belts.
Yeah, that's boy, I don't know what to say about that. That was one of the purposes for them. Although in the 18th century, the buttons were like right at the top of the vents, which is lower than where you would wear a saber belt. Your saber belt is worn much higher around your natural waist. The vents in 18th century were down more at the sacrum. So it wouldn't have done much good there. But when you get into 19th century clothing, particularly like mounted service jackets in the Civil War era, dragoon jackets, they actually had bolsters sewn into the waist of the jacket, which is a little pillow, and they are up right where you want them to be. And that's their actual purpose, is to support the saber belt in the back so it doesn't droop down when you're riding and doesn't fall down around your hips, things like that. But that's waist buttons, my take on it anyway.
Did they use, and Chris, did they use saber hooks back then?
Well, a saber hook on a saber belt was actually a hook that the saber itself would hook onto, so that it wouldn't, when your saber is ready for use, you unhook it and it swings down a little bit farther down so you can reach down, you can grab it easier.
Okay.
And when you're riding, it would be down in that area. It's easier to get hold of. When you're dismounted, you would hook the saber itself up onto the hook on the saber belt, and that would keep the saber from dragging in the ground and swinging and swinging into your legs and stuff when you're actually walking. So that's saber hooks.
Thank you.
I appreciate Matt asking that question, because now I'm like, maybe we can do a program about military uniforms, military clothing through the ages.
Oh yeah.
Well,
but they also
really
if you go back to they actually had hooks in World War I uniforms that were actually inset into the uniform, would come out through tiny little eyelets.
Mm-hmm.
And they were made to keep your belt from sliding down as well. And they were usually brass or steel hooks that were actually mounted inside the jacket, but would protrude through eyelets to the outside. And they were mounted so that the bottom of the belt would sit on that. So again, the belt would not slip down on your hips.
Oh, that's what I was referring to, because I have a coat here in the store that has a saber hook through an eyelet on the side of the coat.
Yep.
And I didn't know if that it happens to be a British Royal Guard uniform.
Yep, that's what it was for. It was for the belt. It's whatever, the walking out belt or their Sam Brown belt or whatever. Yeah. It would just keep it from sliding down on their hips.
Interesting. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank you guys so much for taking the time to join us tonight. I know we've got a ton of people on Facebook who've been watching this, loving every minute of it. I've learned a tremendous amount. I'm not going to feel quite so ignorant next time I go to an equestrian event. Thank you all so much for sharing your knowledge with us. If anyone watching at home didn't get a chance to ask a question, you can leave a comment on Facebook. I'll try to get it to these guys and get your question answered. Again, thank you all so much. For those of you watching at home, if you're interested in joining VPHA for more events, we have a pretty busy spring calendar that we're in the middle of, including events like trail rides, historic trail rides on some of the historic properties in the area. If you don't ride a horse like me, you can also accompany. We have hikes. We've got a bike ride coming up on the C&O Canal. We've got a lot of really great outdoor events to get you out exploring the heritage area. So with that, thank you guys. Thank you everyone who's watching at home. And again, for the Virginia Piedmont Heritage Area, I'm Travis Shaw.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Travis.
Myself.